eyes. He raised one long, bony finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet, and then slowly, deliberately, he stepped back, vanishing into the shadows of the oak tree. Hazel took a shaky breath, her skin prickling as she backed away from the window. She was about to convince herself it had been nothing, just a shadow, when she heard a low, guttural voice echo through the house. "Hazel, I'm coming." The voice was soft, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling every corner of the room, creeping into her ears like a venomous whisper. She felt an icy dread settle over her, and without thinking, she turned and rushed toward the kitchen, hoping to lock herself inside. But as she reached for the door, she stopped dead in her tracks. The man was there, standing in her kitchen, his head tilted at that sickening angle, his eyes hidden in shadow. His skin was pale, stretched thin over his sharp bones, and he wore a wide, unsettling grin that never reached his eyes. Hazel's breath caught in her throat as he lifted one hand, pointing a single, crooked finger at her. "Hazel," he whispered, his voice low and mocking. "Why did you forget us?" She stumbled back, heart pounding, as he took a step forward, his body twitching and jerking like a broken marionette. His fingers curled into claws, and with a sudden, terrifying speed, he lurched toward her. Hazel turned and ran, her bare feet skidding against the cold floor as she fled down the hallway. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear his footsteps behind her, uneven and scraping, as if he was dragging something heavy along the floor. She threw herself into her bedroom, slamming the door and locking it. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she pressed her back against the door, heart hammering as she listened. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. But then, she heard it. A soft, slow scratching against the door, as if long, ragged nails were scraping down its surface. "Let me in, Hazel," the voice hissed, closer now, filled with a dark, twisted hunger. "Don't you remember me?" The door rattled as he pounded against it, and Hazel backed away, clutching her chest as she stumbled toward her bed. She knew she should hide, but her legs felt like they were filled with lead, each step a struggle as the room seemed to tilt and blur around her. She heard a loud crack as the door finally gave way, and he entered, his twisted figure looming in the doorway, grinning at her with eyes that were nothing but hollow, black pits. Hazel backed against the wall, her voice trembling as she whispered, Who are you?" The figure tilted his head, the grin widening until his mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with darkness. "I am everyone you left behind, Hazel," he whispered, his voice layering into countless others, a cacophony of sorrow and rage. "I am your past, your sins, your forgotten promises." As he stepped closer, Hazel saw the faces flickering in and out of his skin. Her husband, her sister, her childhood friend who had died years ago. Each face stared at her with accusing eyes, their expressions twisted with pain and betrayal. The figure's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with an icy grip that burned like fire. "You left us, Hazel," he whispered, his face inches from hers, the countless faces merging into one monstrous hollow-eyed visage. "And now, you will join us." He dragged her forward, his grip unbreakable, and Hazel's vision blurred as he pulled her into the shadows, deeper and deeper into a darkness that seemed to have no end. She could feel herself slipping away, her mind sinking into the cold, endless void as the whispers surrounded her, voices she recognized, all crying out her name, pulling her down into the depths of her own forgotten memories. When morning came, the house was silent, empty, as though no one had ever lived there. But those who passed by swore they could feel a chill emanating from the old place, and some claimed they heard faint whispers drifting through the air, calling for someone named Hazel. And on foggy nights, if you look closely, you might see a shadowy figure standing beneath the oak tree, watching. It was a dark, wind-swept night, and though the old house had withstood countless storms over the years, tonight felt different. Even Grandma Hazel, who had lived in that house for over 60 years, sensed something amiss. She sat alone in her favorite rocking chair by the fireplace, the only light flickering from the dying embers. Outside, branches clawed at the windows like desperate fingers trying to find a way in. But the wind wasn't what unsettled her. She could hear it again, the faint, rhythmic tapping from the attic above, a sound she had dismissed as the house settling, or perhaps mice scampering in the walls. Yet, Tonight, it had a strange, insistent quality, a sound that seemed too deliberate. With a shiver, Grandma Hazel tightened her shawl around her shoulders, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the shadowed corners of the room. She was alone, or so she thought. But in the murky silence, she felt a presence, as though she were being watched from just beyond the edge of the firelight. She recalled the old tales her own grandmother used to tell, about spirits that lingered and how they sometimes grew restless, angry even, when ignored for too long. The tapping grew louder, a slow, rhythmic knock-knock-knock that seemed to mock her heartbeat. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Grandma Hazel stood up, the floor creaking beneath her weight, and began the long, creaky journey up the stairs. She gripped the wooden banister, her knuckles pale under her frail skin, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the hollow darkness. The tapping never stopped. It grew louder, more frenzied, as if whatever was up there knew she was coming. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the door to the attic. She hadn't been up there in years, not since her husband had passed away. The air was thick with dust and memories, but something else lingered there too, something dark and cold that made her stomach churn. She pushed the door open, her heart pounding in her chest, only to be greeted by an icy gust that felt almost like a whisper against her cheek. In the dim moonlight that spilled through the tiny attic window, she could see the old family trunk in the corner, the one that hadn't been touched in decades. The tapping was coming from inside. She took a shaky step forward, her breath misting in the frigid air. Each step she took felt heavier, the air around her thickening with an oppressive weight that made her chest tighten. Finally, she reached the trunk, her fingers trembling as she unlatched it and lifted the lid. Inside was nothing but darkness, an endless, yawning void that seemed to pull her in. And then a hand, cold, bony, and very much alive, shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that belied her frail age. Grandma Hazel tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips as she was dragged into the trunk's depths, where the shadows consumed her, leaving nothing but the soft, rhythmic tapping echoing in the silence of the now empty house.
It had been weeks since Grandma Hazel first heard the scratching. At first, it was soft, barely audible, just a faint sound in the quiet moments of the night. But as the days went by, it grew louder, more insistent, like claws dragging against wood coming from beneath her floorboards. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the house settling, or maybe some rodents beneath the floor. But she knew better. She could feel something watching her, something cold and ancient, lurking just beyond her sight. One night, as she was drifting off to sleep, the scratching stopped. Relief washed over her. But then she heard it, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to crawl up through the floor and slither into her ears, saying her name. Hazel, it breathed, a hollow, hungry sound. She bolted upright, heart racing, eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing there, just the silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on her. She tried to go back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The next night, the scratching returned, more frantic, as if whatever was beneath her floor was desperate to break through. Then, as she lay in bed, clutching her blanket, she felt the unmistakable sensation of something moving under her mattress. A shudder ran through her as she sat up, hands trembling, but there was no one there. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination, a trick of her tired mind. But then she heard it again, the whisper, closer this time, echoing around her like a death rattle. Hazel? She couldn't take it any longer. With a surge of courage, she grabbed her flashlight and climbed out of bed, her bare feet padding across the cold wooden floor. She moved toward the basement, where she thought the sound was coming from. The air grew colder as she descended, each step feeling heavier, as if something was pulling her down. The basement was silent, save for the faint hum of the wind outside. But then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw it. A small, ancient-looking trapdoor she'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind a stack of dusty boxes. She felt a chill creep over her, but something compelled her to move closer. Her hands shook as she reached for the latch, her fingers grazing over its cold, rusted metal. She took a deep breath, bracing herself, and pulled the door open. The smell that hit her was foul, like rotting meat and earth. Shining her flashlight into the darkness below, she caught a glimpse of something moving. A writhing, shifting mass of hands, reaching up from the darkness, fingers bony and clawed, pale as death. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind, and she realized with dawning horror that each of those hands had a face, eyes wide and staring, mouths stretched into soundless screams. They were the faces of her family, her late husband, her parents, her sister. They were all there, twisted and distorted, staring up at her with expressions of rage and agony. "You left us, Hazel," they whispered in unison, their voices merging into one terrible sound. "You left us to die." Hazel stumbled back, a scream rising in her throat. But it was too late. The hands shot up, grabbing her ankles with an iron grip, pulling her down with a strength that was impossible to resist. She thrashed and clawed at the floor, but they only pulled harder, dragging her down into the darkness below. She could feel their fingers clawing at her skin, cold and sharp, pulling her deeper and deeper into the black void beneath the trapdoor. As she was pulled under, the last thing she saw was the trapdoor slamming shut above her, plunging her into darkness. The basement fell silent once more, the scratching finally ceasing. Days later, the house lay empty, silent, except for the faintest whisper that could be heard in the dead of night, a desperate, pleading voice calling out from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. "Help me, please." Now, locals warn anyone who passes by that house not to venture too close, especially at night. They say that if you listen closely, you can still hear Grandma Hazel's cries, echoing from the depths below, trapped in the darkness forever, surrounded by the grasping, hungry hands of those who went before her.
Hazel woke in the dead of night, startled by an intense pressure against her chest, as if something unseen was sitting on her, pushing the air from her lungs. She gasped, clutching at her throat, and slowly her eyes adjusted to the dim light in her room. That's when she noticed the strange shape hovering in the corner. At first, she thought it was a shadow, a trick of the darkness. But then it moved, its form twisting, bending in unnatural ways, stretching long, skeletal limbs toward her. A sickly smell filled the room, like rotting leaves and damp earth, making Hazel's stomach churn. She tried to scream, but the pressure on her chest made it impossible. All she could manage was a hoarse, choked gasp. The shape drifted closer, and Hazel's eyes widened as she realized what it was, a figure with a face that looked disturbingly familiar. It was her, Hazel, but not as she was now. This version of her had sunken eyes, lips drawn tight over teeth, her skin stretched thin and pale, as though she had been buried for centuries. Her doppelganger's mouth opened slowly, a dark, bottomless pit, and a low, guttural whisper filled the room. "You shouldn't have come back here, Hazel." Hazel's heart pounded as she tried to push herself off the bed, but her body felt as though it were frozen in place. The doppelganger drifted even closer, her bony hand reaching out, long fingers curling toward Hazel's face. She could feel the icy air radiating from the figure, seeping into her skin, filling her with a bone-deep dread. "Leave me alone," Hazel whispered, her voice barely audible, but the figure only grinned, her hollow eyes gleaming with a dark, twisted amusement. "There's no leaving now," it hissed. "You brought this upon yourself." And then, without warning, the doppelganger lunged forward, her hand clasping around Hazel's wrist. The room spun, and suddenly, Hazel was no longer in her bedroom. She found herself standing in a strange, dimly lit room that looked like her house, but somehow different. The walls were warped and twisted, as though they were alive, pulsing in time with a heartbeat she could feel underfoot. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and every breath she took tasted stale, like dust and decay. Hazel turned slowly, her heart racing as she took in her surroundings. She recognized the furniture, the photos on the wall, but everything was wrong. The photos showed her family, but their faces were blurred, their eyes darkened and empty. She reached out, fingers trembling, but as soon as she touched one of the frames, a shrill, ear-piercing scream filled the air, echoing around her, seeming to come from all directions at once. Her heart leapt, and she stumbled back, nearly tripping over something soft. She looked down, and her stomach dropped as she saw a long line of footprints in the dust, leading from her spot to the darkened hallway. They were small and delicate like those of a child, and they glistened faintly, as though they had been